Welcome to this Wise Owl tutorial on error handling in Power Automate. Here's what you'll learn during the tutorial. So we'll begin by actually creating an error so we can trap it. That's the fun bit. Then we'll show the try, catch, and finally scope actions that you'll need to create to handle errors. We'll look at configuring run after actions to make sure that they run in the right sequence. And then we'll take a dive into reporting errors. So I'll show how you can report an error simply by just showing there's a problem, and then how you can use the result function to pick up more information about it, what we're trying to achieve with this error reporting, and then the complicated expressions, and they are complicated, that you'll need to create in order to pick up on error messages and actions which have caused them to run. And finally, I'll show how to link to your flow so that when you send an email to yourself saying there's a problem, you'll be able to click on a link and actually show the flow. But that's enough of listening to me, or at least watching me. I'm afraid you still have to listen. I'm going to vanish now, and let's get started. So the first thing we need to do is create an error. A bit self-indulgent really, this. Normally you try to avoid them. So I've got an Excel spreadsheet called Top 10 Films. You can either use in a previous one you've used in other tutorials, or you can actually download this. You'll see from the program notes attached to this video on YouTube where you'll find the file. But for any Excel workbook which contains a table would do, or for that matter, any SharePoint list or any other source of data. So what I'm going to do is create a new flow. I'll make it an instant cloud flow, and I'll call it example of flow containing error. And then we'll create it. Create a new step. Working with Excel, I'll list rows present in a table. We'll quickly choose where the table is. So we'll choose OneDrive for Business, OneDrive. We'll choose the file, which is stored in my case in the films folder, and it's called Top 10 Films. And we will choose the table. And at the moment, everything's going to work perfectly. So let's put an error in. What I'm going to do is show advanced options and add an error that the film name field should be equal to Titanic. And I need to put Titanic in inverted commas. What's wrong with that? The field isn't called film name, it's called title. So this isn't going to work. And what I'll do is add a step at the bottom to display the information as an HTML table, just in case it does work by some miracle. And what we'll do is display the output from the previous step. We're all good to go. So that's my non-working flow. I think what we ought to do is just check it doesn't work before we continue. It would be disappointing to implement error checking and then find it wasn't needed. So I'm running my flow, and sure enough, it's failed as I expected it to. And you can see it doesn't actually display the name of the field, so it would be up to me to guess what the problem is. So the basic principle of error trapping is fairly easy to understand. You take the series of statements which you think might go wrong, and you stick them into a separate scope, and then check whether that scope crashes. So typically what you would do is insert 3 new actions. Each one will be a scope, and to make it clearer, you should rename them. So I'll call this first one try, and this is the things I'm going to try to do. What I can do is drag my actions, because I can't be sure which of them, if any, is going to crash, into my try block. What I can then do underneath that is add another scope. This one I will call catch. These are standard programming terms, try and catch, as is the final term, which will be finally. So I'll add another scope. And this one I will call, this will stick to my convention of using capital letters, finally. That is what error trapping should look like in Power Automate. What we now need to do is work out when the different blocks are going to run by specifying a run after condition. So what I want to do now is work out the sequence of actions. The idea behind this is the try clause will always run, the catch clause will run only if the try one fails, and the finally one will run under all possible circumstances to mop up all other conditions. To be honest, I tend to miss out the finally clause and would delete it. And the reason is you can just run additional statements at the bottom of your flow and they will have pretty much the same effect. There is a subtle difference, but for most people, I don't think you need to know it. So what we're going to do is configure the try clause to say what happens after it. And you can't do that, it's grayed out. And it tells you why. you can't configure run after an action directly following a trigger. This will happen under all circumstances. It's the catch clause where you need to configure what happens. So if you click on the three dots next to the catch and choose configure run after, and what we're going to do is say that it will run if the try clause fails. We'll probably also run if the try clause is skipped for some reason, or if it times out. It's up to you really whether you tick all these three boxes. And finally, if you'll excuse the pun, for the finally clause, we can click on the three dots and configure this. And this should probably run under all possible circumstances. So what you'll see, there's no direct link between the names you've chosen to give the blocks, try, catch, and finally, and what they actually do. It's up to you to give them sensible names which correlate with what the run after actions actually do. What I'd now like to do is to say if something goes wrong, what's happened. So I'm going to send myself an email in the catch clause. Remember, this will only run if there's an error. And you can see the Power Automate has considerably coloured this arrow red to show this is an error condition. So I'll add an action. I'll send myself an email to notify myself I've created a problem. And the email will go to me, Delegate 51, and it will have a subject saying, I need to spell that correctly. And in an ideal world, the body of the email will say what the problem is. We'll come to that in a bit. For the moment, I'll just put problem. So if I now try running this, and I'm going to run it twice. The first time I'll run it with an error, the second time without. So there's my first time. And what you should see from the flow of tasks is that the try clause failed and the catch clause succeeded. One important consequence of adding error handling is your flows will always succeed, so that can be a bit worrying. So as promised, what I'm now going to do is change it. I'm going to go to my OData filter, and I'm going to actually delete that for the moment and save this, and then try running it. So I reckon this will work perfectly, and it won't send me an email. And you can see it ran the try clause, missed out the catch clause, and ran the finally clause. Now, I'm not expecting you to believe me about the email, so let's go and have a look at that. If I go to my Outlook account, and there's my email saying, so it really did work. What I now need to do is send myself some useful information so I can see not just that there's a problem, but a bit more information about what it was. So just before we proceed with detecting and showing error information, I just need to go back in, and I've replaced my filter query so my query flow will crash again. What I suggest doing is going away and making a coffee before you watch this in the next tutorial, because you'll need a clear head for this, I would say. So what I would like to do is display the results of the error. Now, let me show you why this is going to be slightly harder to do than you might expect. If I run my query, what you're used to be able to do, let's just turn my sound off so that doesn't happen again. What we used to be able to do is to look at the results of stages, and you can still do that. You can click on individual action and see the results of it. But what you can't do is see the result of the scope in which it crashed. What I'm now going to do is show you how to get around this. You can see the scope is called try and contains two actions. One is called list rows present in a table, and the other is called create HTML table. And although we can see on screen which one's crashed, don't forget that when we run the flow, it could be either of them. It could be any of the actions within our scope. And what ideally we'd like to do is to tell ourselves not only which action went wrong, but what the error message was. So that's what we're going to do. Now, in order to be able to do this, what we're going to do is to add within our, sorry, that's the wrong scope, is to add within the catch scope, where the error is occurring, an action. What I'd like to do is to add the action above the sending email, but I've learned from experience that's quite difficult to do, so I'm going to add it below and then move it up. And what the action will do is just compose some results. What it's going to do is show the results of the try action up there, or the try scope. Now this is a non-standard expression. It won't be in dynamic content. You can actually find it if you keep scrolling down this list. Eventually you will get to the referencing functions, And many of both the most useful things in Power Automate and the most complicated are in this section. What I want to do is pick up on the result function. What I can do now is to type in the name of my scope, which is try, and what that will do is display some information about what went wrong. It will display the error output. And what I'll then do is send appropriate information to myself. I can't drag that above the send an email, but I can drag this, if I just collapse it, I can drag the send email below it, which is what I want to do. So what I'm going to do now is try running this to see what the output of this looks like. Scary is the answer. So if I run my flow, if I have a look at the output, you can see from my compose function that the output looks like this. Deep breath. So there are two separate parts to this. The first part is the first action, which begins there and carries on down. And the second part, if I scroll down, is the second action for creating an HTML table. Each action has a part. Each part is called name and has a status. The first action returned a status code of failed. And the second action, if I could just scroll down to it, can I just see that down here? The status code of skipped. I'm only interested in the actions which failed. So what I need to do in outline, and we'll do this in the next part of this tutorial, is detect all the actions where the status is failed, and for each one of those, report on the error. And to find the error, what I'm going to have to do is go to the output section. Within that, go to the body section. Within that, go to the message section and display this error message. So there's a fair bit of JSON syntax to come. I suspect I may need to refer to this, so I'm just going to copy that to the clipboard and paste it into my notepad, and I'd encourage you to do the same thing so you've got it to refer back to, otherwise it will disappear. Okay, so let's have a go at doing this. I think this is such a complicated thing to do, and probably one of the harder things you can do in Power Automate. We'll have a quick preview of what the results look like. It will teach you loads about JSON expressions though. So what I want to do is change my flow so it does this. It gets the results from the try block, we've done that, and then it filters it using a filter array action to show only the failed actions, the one where the status is failed. What it will then do is pick out the bits of information I want, which are the name of the action and the error message. I'll do that twice in two different ways because I want to illustrate the point. And then we'll present that in an HTML table and embed that within an email. And none of that will make sense until you see the result, which will look like this. So what I'm going to do is start with a preamble and then display this table. So there'll be 3 columns giving the action name, which caused the problems, and 2 different ways of expressing the error message because I want to show the same thing twice in 2 ways. So that's what we're aiming towards. Okay, let's make it happen. So I think we've probably put this off for as long as it's feasible. Let's actually do it. What I'm going to do is rename my compose action to begin with to get results from problem scope, because that's what it's doing. And what I now need to do is to add an action which will filter those to just show where the problems lay. So I'm going to add a filter action, filter array. And the array it will filter is the outputs from the previous set. So that's all the results from the try scope. And what I want to do is filter it where the field called status equals failed. I think a quick refresher is in order here. I don't know if you remember me saying that for every action there's 2 fields, the name, and then I showed you there was a status, and what I want to do is show all the ones where the status has failed. So what I can do is use, I can use item to refer to each row, and I can say within the item, I can pick up on the status field within that. And choose OK. What I want to do is show all the ones where that's failed. So the output of that should be a set of rows of actions which have failed. What I'm then going to do after that is to select just the bits of information I'm interested in. So I'll use a select statement or select action to take the output from the previous filter and pick out only certain bits of information. So this is where the fun really begins. The bit of information I want to pick out is the name. Actually, let's do the easy bit first. The name. The name is easy enough. So what I can do is from my expression here, I can type in the item, and then I can refer to the name. Put a close square brackets in, and I'll call that the action name. The second bit of information, I'll call this error version 1. I'm going to do 2 versions of this. And for this, I need to pick out the following information. I want to display that information, the error message. And that is within the output section. Within that, there's a body section. Within that, there's an error section. Within that, you can just about see it there, there's a message section. Output, body, error, message. So to do that, I can go to my expression and type in item, open close brackets, and then I can begin my journey. So I can pick out the outputs section. Then I can put the, I've already forgotten what the next section is, body, I think. Then I can put the error section, and then I can put the message section. And to be honest, the chances of you getting all these right, or indeed me getting it all right, are pretty slim. I'm just going to copy that to the clipboard because I'm going to need it in a second. And for the error version 2, I'll do the same thing, but possibly slightly easier. What you can do is use this syntax. When you're just referring to a sequence of properties in a hierarchy, you can write it like this. So that will refer to the property called message and the property called error and the property called body and the property called outputs. I'm just going to quickly check. No, let's go for it. Let's go for it and see what happens. So that's the output from my select statement. I didn't use a question mark. I'm assuming that these properties will actually exist. If they don't, this will crash within my error checking, which happens. So what I can now do is add another action. And what this will do is display this information in a nice HTML table. I'll create an HTML table based on the output from the previous action. And then in my send email, what I'll do is change my message to say the following problems have occurred. I say problems because it's conceivable I may get 2 different actions failing. And what I can then do is stick in the result of my action, which will be an HTML table. So what I can now do is save that, and then I'm going to try running it. Now, it's quite possible this contains an error. No matter how many times you prepare something, getting everything exactly right when you're preparing these is difficult, but let's see if it works. Okay, it's failed on the try and passed the catch. That is actually quite promising. Let's see what I got out of it. Ah, and there's my error message. Right first time. What I was actually going to show you, but don't now have the opportunity to, is to be very careful if you make a mistake. When you make a mistake and want to correct it, you can overtype the expression, but make sure when you do that, you click on the update button. Twice when I was preparing this, I made a mistake, corrected it, and somehow didn't press update. So it just ran exactly the same flow with the same error again, and I had to go back in and do it all over again. So do be careful to update any changes you make. So the final thing it would be really nice to do with this flow is send an email like this. So it says what the problems which have occurred are and lists them out in a table, but then has a link to the flow. And so when you click on the link, it will take you to the flow and show you what the problem was. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Here's how to do that. I'm not going to show you all of the theory. Instead, what we'll use is a file provided with a video. Again, you can go to the video footnotes on YouTube and you'll see where the file is stored on our website. So I need to do 2 things to get this to work. The first thing I'm going to do is to add a step towards the top of the flow. And what that will do is initialize a variable. And I'll set my variable to be called flow URL, let's say, and it's going to be a string of text, and I'll set it equal to something. I'm just going to put a space in there for the moment. This is very hard to work with because it's quite a long expression. It's well worth going into Power Automate settings at this point In fact, before I do that, I'll just save my flow, otherwise I'll lose it. It's well worth clicking on settings, going to Power Automate settings, choosing experimental features so that you get the expression editor. What you can then do is go into the text file I mentioned earlier and copy this expression in. It's a bit of a monster. And what that will do is evaluate to a URL like this, which is the right syntax for going to a website showing you your flow. So we'll copy this expression in, making sure I don't get too much into my variable. So with a bit of luck, I'll have a bit more space to work with. So what this does, the concatenate function joins things together. So it joins together a few bits of text. It starts with the stem of the URL. Then it uses the workflow function, which returns information about the workflow, about the flow. And in the tag section, it picks up in the environment name. Then it adds in the word /flows. Then it adds in the name of the workflow. Then it adds in the word runs. And then it adds in the name of the run. All very guessable, I'm sure you'd agree. So just to remind you what this is actually trying to reproduce is something like that. So we're filling in the XXX, YYY, and ZZZ of this expression. So that's my variable. What I can now do is go to my catch clause and amend my email to include it. So I'm going to say, you can click here to see this flow. But I now need to insert the URL. Now the best way to do this is to turn on HTML tags by clicking on this icon. And an HTML hyperlink begins with an angle brackets A. You then put href equals, so welcome to HTML, and within 2 double quote marks, you can put in a reference to this variable. So I can add in my variable at this point, which is flow URL. And I could even show off by adding a title field saying show flow, and that will appear when you hover over it. What you then need to do is to close your tag. So if you've never used HTML before, welcome to it. Marvel at how primitive it is. And I think I've got the syntax to that right. Let's find out. So if I save that, I'm just going to show I'm not cheating. I'm going to delete all the previous occurrences of this email and then try running this. So if I run this flow, it's looking good. And if I go to my email, you can see my link is there. You can see if I hover over it, I get the title caption I was talking about. And if I click on that, I can show my flow. And that has all been worth it because that looks really impressive.